Today on Public Research.
This man was the master of reinvention.
Yes.
And the man reinvented himself time after time after time successfully. The man was never going to be a Rebbe, becomes a Rebbe. Becomes a Rebbe, he doesn't want to be a normal Rebbe, he becomes a pioneer to Palestine. That doesn't work out, so he goes to New York and goes to the shipyard. That doesn't work out, or he moves on, he becomes an irreligious Jew and is a real estate guy. Then he goes to university. I mean, the man literally has reinvented himself countless times in his life, successfully, amazing. I think he realized at different points in his life, and maybe that's a healthy thing to be able to do, that what worked for him 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago doesn't work now. Now I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do the thing that works for me now, because that's actually better than trying to continue to do the thing that didn't work for me until now.
Rabbi Pini Dunner, the London-born Beverly Hills rabbi, on his latest fascinating chronicle of Jewish history, Paradise Cove, They Escaped the Cuckoo's Nest, which reveals for the first time the many improbable lives and reinventions of the Polish Rebbe who helped hundreds of Polish Jews survive the Holocaust, got trapped in America in 1938, lost his faith, became the oldest college student in the state of California before reinventing himself once again, returning to Israel and reconnecting to his Jewish roots. An improbable tale of reinvention and exile, and a discussion of the state of the Jewish diaspora. All that and more on today's episode of Public Research. You got a phone call years ago from a book collector
A book dealer. His name was Moshe Leib Weiser. He died of COVID in 2020.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wonderful, wonderful man. But I was renowned in the book dealer world as a collector of oddities, particularly polemics, but anything controversial. I have a very large collection of controversial material. And if anything, any dealer at that time, I don't buy as much anymore, but at the time, I really was, rapacious in my appetite. And if something, was interesting or even possibly interesting, I would get a call from a dealer. Anyway, he called me up and he said he's got a fascinating pamphlet. I think I may have it here. Do you mind if I get it out? I didn't know you were going to ask me about it.
Go for it.
Hold on a minute. I'll let me find it. Here it is. Yeah, I've actually got a few versions of the pamphlet now.
Wow.
I used to only have one, but since then I bought a few. So this one, I rebound it. It's in Hebrew. Hasidim alu el haaretz, and in it, can you see the image on the front?
Yeah.
The image on the front is that you can see there that this is the Yablonna Rebbe. His name was Rabbi Yecheskel Tal, and the premise of the pamphlet is it's published by Zionists, by the Keren Kayemet Israel, Kakal, who were buying up land, and they were then settling Jews into that land in Eretz Israel, at that time Palestine, at that time mandatory Palestine under the British. Here is the title page. I've never actually shown this before to anyone, but
wow.
So it says it's a fascinating book. It says Chasidim alu el haaretz lityashvut Chasidei Yablonna v'Koznitz be'emek Yisrael. It's discussing the Hasidim who went on Aliyah. That means they emigrated to the land, talking about Eretz Israel. It's discussing Hityashvut, the settlement of the Hasidim of Yablonna and Koznitz in the Jezreel Valley. Okay, and it's a whole description. You can see here the pictures. These are pictures which are not available. I'm covering my face there, but these are pictures of these Hasidic farmers, agricultural workers, building Kfar Hasidim, which is a village in northern Israel. Here they are, more photographs. This is quite a
And
sophisticated
this from the 20s, right? This book.
1920s. This was published in 1926, this pamphlet. Um, I have a few copies of this. I have another one in Yiddish. So this is a very interesting picture here. This is a picture of the kids being taught. The person teaching them was a man called Shin Shalom. He also later became irreligious. We're going to hear about Yablonna Rebbe in a minute. But Shin Shalom was a very famous poet in Israel. His father was called Admur. What's the word? He was known as the artist rabbi. He was a painter. His father was a famous Hasidic Rebbe who turned his hand to painting. Fascinating. These were descendants of the Rizhin Hasidic dynasty. Here you see Hasidic women milking the cows. Hold on. Here's the Bis Medrash. Can you see this wooden Bis Medrash?
Yeah.
Now, but you're wondering what's the story behind this. So the story is very simple. The story is that Orthodox Jews, by and large, were against Zionism, and certainly the leadership. I'm talking about Haredim, what we would refer today as Haredim. Haredi Jews were against Zionism. And the sense was that the Zionist movement was led by people who were anti-religious, and therefore to get into bed with them, to coin a phrase, was to dilute your own fealty, your own loyalty to your faith, to your religious beliefs, because you don't ever allow yourself to be controlled by people who have no respect for halakha and no respect for Torah. And the leaders of the Zionist movement, beginning with Herzl, but everybody that followed on from him as well, did not believe in halakha and certainly were not observant of all the mitzvot in the Torah and as prescribed by halakha. So you couldn't possibly allow yourself to be led by them or to be influenced by them or to be in any kind of project with them.
There were some religious, like I
Yes.
think Moshe Feigelin's great-great-grandfather came from Russia around
So the Mizrahi movement did attract a lot of religious leaders, and there was among what we would refer to today as Amcha, the ordinary folk, there was a tremendous yearning for the Zionist project. Even if they couldn't bring themselves to align themselves with Zionists, the concept of Jews being allowed to resettle in Eretz Yisrael was something that appealed to people's religious sensitivities, sensibilities. And there was a surge of religious immigration into the land of Israel, some of it with Zionist support, as was the case with the Yablonna Rebbe, and some of it, not with, cooperating with the Zionists somewhat because they were the ones with access. But I'll give you an example. There was a man called Rabbi Gershton Korn, and he founded a city called Bnei Brak. And Bnei Brak was not a Zionist town at that stage. It's on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. At that stage, there was nothing much there. It was just a desert scrub. But he had this idea to build a city which would be predominantly for religious Jews who wanted to move to Eretz Yisrael, at that time Mandate Palestine. And he bought the land and he settled it. But it wasn't a Zionist project. It was an urban setting for religious Jews who didn't want to necessarily live in Jerusalem or in Tveria or Tzfat or Hebron, which were the four religious settlement areas of Eretz Yisrael. So the Yablonna Rebbe, what the pamphlet was saying, came to Eretz Yisrael with the Zionist movement. That was shocking to me. And so Leib Weiser was able to convince me to buy this pamphlet, which is why I was able to show it to you just now.
Let me ask what an outsider might ask, which is when somebody says, I'm into controversial books or old books, one expects them to say, oh, here's a copy of Der Stürmer. For you, why was that a controversial book?
So the world I come from, which is a Haredi world, any cooperation between Haredim and Zionists is seen as controversial. It would also be controversial if there was a pamphlet, of which I have many, where there's a rabbi fighting another rabbi about, let's say, kashrut, or a rabbi fighting another rabbi about the status of a child, whether they are or not a mamzer. These are more halachic aspects of Jewish life, but any aspect of Jewish life which somehow arouses indignation can be controversial if it's published in a pamphlet or in what's called a pashkavil. I don't know if you know what that word means. It's kind of a poster or flyer which will convey information about some controversial topic, or banning something, or protesting against something. And there's even books which are controversial because they're written by a rabbi who says something which is so novel and so out of sync with what current practice and thinking is, that it's considered controversial. So those are the things that are attractive. If somebody collects what's called, you refer to der Stürmer, that's anti-Semitica. I don't collect anti-Semitica. It's not of no interest to me. I don't particularly care for it. I'm sure there are people with it. There's people who collect anything relating to the Holocaust. I don't collect that either. I have Holocaust material. I also have anti-Semitic material, but generally speaking, that's not my field of interest. My field of interest is something which is really self-contained within the Jewish world, which somehow is about, it relates to a controversial topic in that moment in time, and that its publication was
controversies of the Jewish world. Yeah,
controversies of the Jewish world, polemics. So polemics is a actual field within the collecting world, not just in the Jewish world. Polemics is, in the old days you didn't have X, and you didn't have online warriors who were able to use social media to project their anger. That is usually pamphleteers. And so there's a lot of pamphlets which relate to polemics, arguments, disputes, debates, which at the time would create a massive storm.
So you see this book and this picture and this character stays with you. Well, let's just quickly back up for outsiders to explain some things. Okay, first thing, what's the difference between a rabbi and a rebbe?
It's a good question. Yeah. And it relates to a man who lived in the late 18th century, mid 18th century, called the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was a rabbi in a place called Podolia, which is in the Ukraine. And it was not not an area which was known for its Jewish scholarship or, famous and well-established Jewish communities in terms of what in those days would be considered the international Jewish scene. And nevertheless, there were many Jews there. And I guess they felt somewhat isolated or marginalized. And the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, who happens to be an ancestor of my wife, founded, he probably didn't know he was founding it, founded something called the Hasidic movement. He was an inspirational figure. He was a good speaker. He was very much in tune with the needs of the people. I'm talking about the emotional needs and the spiritual needs of the people. So he wasn't merely someone who was a rabbi in the sense that he told them, this is what you can do on Shabbat and this is what you can't do on Shabbat. He was, I would say, much more about people's feelings and people's sensitivities in terms of their spiritual growth. And he was also somewhat, although this is a controversial topic, an anti-intellectual. That doesn't mean he didn't believe in the study of Torah or something like that, but what it meant is that he didn't consider people who were students of Torah to have any primacy over those who were ordinary folk, the cobbler and the tailor and the candlestick maker. Those are also important people. Now, maybe they can only pray and they can't study Talmud, but that doesn't mean that they're not important. And therefore, he created this movement, which grew after he died under a man called the Maggid of Mezrich, in which the leader of a community was not necessarily a scholarly rabbi, didn't need to be a scholarly rabbi. It could be that he was a scholarly rabbi, but he was a Rebbe. A Rebbe meant that he was also a spiritual mentor to those he led. And this became a central theme within mainly Eastern European Jewry at the time. So it was in Ukraine, Russia, wherever they were allowed in the Russian Empire, also in Poland, which at that time was also part of the Russian Empire, and then it spilled over into Galicia, which was at that point in time part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then into Hungary. So those areas became somewhat Hasidic. Not all the rabbis were Hasidic. So if somebody was merely a rabbi of a community, he would be called the rabbi. If somebody was the Rebbe, then he would be considered a spiritual mentor, and his followers, his groupies, as you might put it, might not necessarily just come from the location where he lived, the city where he lived, but they might come from across Ukraine or from across Galicia or from across Poland, and they would gravitate towards him on special occasions.
I'm
would be their leader.
I'm going to embarrass myself with some.
Don't embarrass yourself. Nothing you say will embarrass yourself.
Well, I'm going to reveal my ignorance, but I think it might represent maybe much of the audience. So the Vilna Gaon, okay?
Vilna Gaon.
And I think that might mean the genius of Vilna.
Yes.
And this is a person, and this is a dynasty, and was this person
neither of the two?
No,
okay. The person.
Vilna Gaon. Was this a Rebbe? Was he a Rebbe? No.
So Vilna Gaon is an interesting man because the Vilna Gaon represented the group within Judaism at the time. He died in the late 18th century, so he overlapped with the Baal Shem Tov, but they never met each other or anything like that. They lived in different areas. But he represented the group within Jewish life that was very opposed to the Hasidic movement. They became known as the mitnagdim, the opposers. So the Hasidim were those who were the pious ones. That's what Hasid means, pious. And the mitnagdim were those who opposed the Hasidim. And they felt that this movement challenged traditional norms within the Jewish world, the religious Jewish world. So there were these two opposing forces, both very forcefully projected within their own communities. Those who followed the Vilna Gaon, also known by his acronym HaGaon, Rabbi Eliyahu, so the Gra, that's how he's known. And there were many, he wasn't a Rebbe, he was a rabbi. He was actually not the rabbi of a town. He was just a teacher who lived in Vilna, and he had his own small coterie of followers and students. And then there was the Baal Shem Tov and those who came after him. And what's interesting about the Baal Shem Tov is that that he set up an idea which slowly grew and slowly became the norm within the Hasidic world, that a rabbi who is a Rebbe has their family have dynastic rights. So it's their son and then their grandson or their great-grandson-in-law who's going to take over this particular rabbinic line. In the world of the Mitnagdim, that's the Vilna Gaon's world, that wasn't the case at all. It could be that the son of a rabbi would become a rabbi, but it could also be that would be his main student. So, for example, the person who really took over from the Vilna Gaon was a man called Reb Chaim of Volozhin, no relation of the Vilna Gaon. He became the head of a yeshiva in Volozhin, and that yeshiva became the centerpiece, the flagship institution of the Mitnagdic world. Whereas in the Hasidic world, it was very much dynasty. So many of those were set up in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as indeed the Yablonna Rebbe, who we're going to eventually discuss.
So in Poland, let's say in the 20s, how many Rebbes? I'm sorry, I'm saying it wrong every time, aren't I?
Rebbe, no, it's
Rebbe.
right. Rebbe, how many Rebbes were there?
Okay.
In the 1920s, there were probably dozens, if not hundreds, of Rebbes across Poland and what remained of the Russian Empire. At that stage, Poland had actually absorbed Galicia, which was originally part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now it was part of Poland, the Polish Republic.
So just for the audience, these were important.
So I'm going to explain to your audience. There were Rebbes who had 100,000 followers, And there were Rebbes who couldn't scratch together a dozen followers. Because if you were the Rebbe of some little village and your great grandfather happened to be a famous rabbi, you could call yourself the whatever it was Rebbe. Let's say, you came from Beverly Hills and you set up a little shul in Beverly Hills. You could call yourself the Beverly Hills Rebbe. Why? Because your great grandfather was a famous Rebbe and you could claim descent, and therefore through dynastic rights you could take on that name. And you'd attach the name of whoever your great grandfather was to your dynasty, or you just take on the name of the local, like Beverly Hills, and become the Beverly Hills Rebbe, descended from the famous Rebbe, whoever it was. Now, if you were the rabbi of a tiny village and you considered yourself a Rebbe, then your Hasidim were really only in that village. Nobody else cared. But if you were the rabbi of, let's say, for example, there was the Gerer Rebbe, there was the Alexander Rebbe, who was the rabbi of Alexandrovsk. There was the Bobova Rebbe, who was a rabbi in a place called Bobova, not far from Krakow. These people all had thousands, if not tens of thousands of Hasidim that was spread across Poland. So there were low-ranking Rebbes with very few followers and high-ranking A-list Rebbes with tens of thousands or more than 100,000 followers. And then there were what I would call middle-ranking Rebbes. I would say the Yablonna Rebbe fits into that category.
So we're going to zoom ahead into the book. I promise you, it's just fascinating. I have to ask this one question. I'm just so curious. If you saw the Vilna Gaon,
Go on.
Please correct me if I'm saying these words wrong. If I saw him on the street and I saw Hasidim in that era, could I tell the difference visually?
No, you wouldn't be able to really distinguish between them. They would look the same. I mean, maybe minor differences, but to an outsider who's seeing a religious Jew in a black hat or a fur hat and a long coat, kaftan, they wouldn't be noticeably different. They're bearded, they have the side locks. They would not be noticeably different.
So do you still have that book that you showed us with you?
Yes.
Do you have the picture of the young Yablonna?
Yeah. Here's the picture. You can see him there. He's got the big black yarmulke on, and you can see his side locks and a beard. He's wearing a white shirt.
And he brought all these Poles to Israel.
And you can see the Hasidim there with beards who are talking to him, holding agricultural tools. And those Hasidim, so they came from Yablonna in Poland. But it could very well be that if you wouldn't know and you wouldn't listen to them speak with their particular accent, their Polish accent, an elderly Jew from the Mitnagdim who lived in Vilna would look exactly the same. They wouldn't look different. And he doesn't look that different from a rabbi in Lithuania.
So to zoom ahead, I want to share a video with you. So for the audience, the man you're about to see is the same man that Rabbi Dunner just showed us, and this is many decades later.
George Nagel, the oldest or youngest living alumnus of this university, who is now here taking postgraduate studies and remains in one of the dormitories or living facilities of the university. Mr. Nagel is a great lover of the university libraries, which endears him to me immediately. He is also our youngest author and has recently written a book on some of his experiences in dealing with mental patients who are in a rehabilitation center near the campus. Mr. Nagel is a native of Poland and was a former contractor and builder in the Valley and in the Los Angeles area. Mr. Nagel has made his career in education during the last few years. But George, I understand that your early education took place in Poland, not in the formal school at all. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And especially because I'm Jewish and Jews had...
I don't want to play it forever. It's a fascinating interview that you found. I highly recommend. But I just want to play that to zoom ahead because just to inform the audience about...
So the little man on the right with the very 70s T-shirt is none other than the Yablonna Rebbe, the great-grandson of Rabbi Cheskel Taub of Kushmirsh, who was one of the great Hasidic rabbis, Rebbes of Poland in the early 19th century. He was born in 1895. His father, Rabbi Yaakov Taub was the Rebbe of Yablonna. Yablonna is like a resort town about 45 minutes outside of Warsaw. Maybe in those days it took longer to get there. It's where people had nice big estates. It was the countryside, and there was a lovely Jewish community there. Probably a few hundred families. And he was the Rebbe of Yablonna, Rabbi Yaakov Taub. He died young in 1920, and he had 4 daughters and 1 son. Now, originally, one of his daughters had married a man called Van Chotzker. I can't remember his first name. And he was meant to take over and become, as the son-in-law, become the Rebbe of Yablonna, because obviously he was suited to that task. For reasons which are very clear, he wasn't able to take over because he died. He died young. And therefore, when the Yablonna Rebbe himself died, that means the father of the man in the video, Rabbi Yaakov Taub, died. He was in 1920, he was either 59 or 60 years old. He had a young son of 25 who was now eligible for the role of Yablonna Rebbe. And that's what he became. And it was, as I said before, middle-ranking Hasidic group. There was probably a few hundred families in Yablonna, and probably another few hundred scattered around Poland, probably most of them in the Warsaw area. So I would be sure that there was, a Yablonna center in Warsaw and in other towns and cities located not far from there. And they would probably visit him for Shabbat, and they would visit him on Jewish festival days, and he would visit them. That's the course of the way a rabbinic court would run. They would come to him, they would bring him money, they would ask for blessings, and he was a Hasidic Rebbe. At some point, and for more details, you'll have to look at the book, the introduction to the book, he became besotted with the idea of Jewish resettlement in the land of Jewish heritage, Eretz Yisrael, not then called Israel, it was called Palestine. And this was part of a surge in interest in Zionist projects because of the Balfour Declaration. In 1917, Arthur Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild to tell him that he agreed with the idea of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. And the British, who took over the British mandate in the early 1920s, they opened the gates for Jewish immigration until the late 1930s. And during that time, tens of thousands of Jews immigrated. Most of those Jews who immigrated were not religious. So these were people who had become Zionists, were escaping anti-Semitism in Europe, believed that Judaism as a religion was anachronistic, and they believed in Jewish national identity from all different directions. Some of them were very nationalistic and right-wing, conservative, we would call it today. Others were socialist and communists of all different shapes and stripes and colors. And they moved and immigrated to the land of Israel. Religious Jews, if they moved, tended not to be a part of that. They didn't found a kibbutz or an agricultural settlement. The Yablonna Rebbe was so moved and motivated by the Zionist project that he decided that it's not enough just for him to go and to go with, his family, but he wanted to bring his entire Hasidic group to the land of Israel and set up a Hasidic group in its entirety in a new location, in the location of Jewish yearning, the land of Israel. It was a messianic project. And this man, Rabbi Yecheskel Taub, who you saw in the picture in the booklet, and who you saw later in the video, which we'll get to, brought hundreds of people. In the 1920s, they went to the Jezreel Valley, they built an agricultural settlement, and slowly but surely, others were coming, some went back. It didn't really work out. To be honest, it was a bit of a flop, a disaster, because there was malaria, the swamps, they couldn't drain the swamp. These were not expert agricultural workers, didn't really know what they were doing. So, and he ran out of money, had to reach new arrangements with the Zionists and bring people in who weren't Hasidim. It was all a bit of a disaster.
I mean, what would be the modern equivalent? It would be like somebody from Chicago moving to Africa? Like what?
Well, I mean, it's moving to a third world country. I don't know about Chicago, but let's say you would decide you want to start an agricultural settlement. But I mean, Poland,
Yeah.
you're moving from a fairly modern country, for all intents and purposes in those days, a first world country, to a third world country where there's no infrastructure. If you want
Malaria.
electricity, you have to build a generator. If you want water, you have to dig a well. There's no infrastructure. If you want a road, for example, Rabbi Tab, the Yablonna Rebbe, this young man, lobbied for them to build a road, the British to make a road between Kfar Hasidim and Haifa, which was the nearest city. There was no road. You can imagine that if you wanted to you have to go by horse and buggy. I don't know how they went, but there was no roads. So, we come to Israel today and it has the feel of a first world country. It's in those days, it had very recently been a sleepy outpost of the Ottoman Empire and a very underfunded outpost of the Ottoman Empire, which had been abused.
A lot of malaria.
Yeah, a lot of it was completely corrupt. The people who had been running the region, it was southern Syria. It was the region of Palestine in the southern Syria district of the Ottoman Empire. And the people who were running it were all utterly corrupt. Arabs, Turks, and Arabs were utterly corrupt. So they would collect local taxes, but they wouldn't invest in Palestine. They would just take the money and put it in the bank and use it for themselves. So it was a terrible place. I mean, for the fact that he convinced hundreds of people to come must have meant he was an enormously charismatic figure and one who held great sway with his followers to get them to do that.
Yeah. When I got the book, I immediately searched for the word Bundist, because because of events in our world, I'm increasingly fascinated with Polish Jewry before the Holocaust and these debates between the Bundists and the Zionists. But I couldn't find the word Bund. Because, and tell me about this. So he belongs to this 20s Zionism, which is this of a different flavor?
Yeah, it's the early Zionists were pioneers of a very rustic sort. They were very motivated by feelings of nationalism, of a revived national spirit of the Jewish people. They were, for example, one of the great early Zionists was a man called Asher Ginsburg, Achad Ha'am. He came up with the concept of cultural Judaism. He himself came from a very religious background, but he had drifted away from that, and he created this concept of a cultural, national Jewish identity. And they founded towns and cities and settlements in at that time, Ottoman Palestine. And he believed in, for example, the revival of the Hebrew language, because Jews in Europe didn't speak Hebrew, they spoke Yiddish. Or they spoke a local language. They may have spoken Polish or Hungarian. They certainly didn't speak Hebrew. But he believed in the revival of the Hebrew language. I'll give you an example. Theodor Herzl never spoke Hebrew. He spoke German. That was his language. He was from Vienna. He spoke and wrote German. The great early Zionists never spoke Hebrew, but they believed in this, and they were willing to go to a country, teach themselves a new language, learn to operate within this, what we would consider third world environment. I would say, if you want to compare it to anyone, you're talking about the Americans of the 1800s who struck westward, in a horse and buggy, and faced the elements and the danger from Native Americans and who knows what. And they built slowly but surely. They headed further and further west until they hit the Pacific. That's really the kind of thing we're talking about. These were Jews who felt so strongly about their Jewish identity, but not from a religious perspective, that they came and settled the land. After the Balfour Declaration, which was seen by religious Jews who were not Zionists in messianic terms, many religious Jews suddenly felt that actually this is a real thing. This is no longer just a crazy idea of secular Jews. This is a real thing. This is part of the Jewish story. And that's why there was a greater surge, or a real surge, in religious immigration. And I think that the primary example of that is this man, Rabbi Yecheskel Taub, because he brought an entire community, whereas others went as individuals. He decided to come as a community and rebuild his community in Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, what I was expecting when I was reading the book was the typical. I've seen these letters that are just tragic of like Polish Jews, begging anti-Zionist Jews, please leave. You're not safe, and they didn't leave, and they died. And so I had imagined the Zionism as mostly fear-based.
Zionism of the 1920s
Yes.
in Poland was not fear-based.
Yeah.
It was messianic. It was religious. It was nationalistic. And don't forget that the interwar years were the years when nationalism was a dominant force in the Western world. And obviously, the ultimate example, and I'm not making any comparison, is what happened in Germany, where nationalism became the dominant ideal of the German people. But it wasn't just Germany, it was Poland and Czechoslovakia. And, even Russia, the communist Russia, was all about the Russian national ideal, which they identified with communism. Lithuania became independent. Latvia became independent. So a lot of an outbreak of national revival in the Western world. And that really was something that also it was infused into the Jewish people. It never really existed before. Judaism was always seen as a faith, and Jewish identity was always seen as faith-based. But somehow and it was a 19th century idea, which had its peak in the 1920s and 30s, somehow it also became a dominant theme of the Jewish conversation, and many people were enthused by it. And this Rebbe, this Hasidic Rebbe, with his thousands of followers and hundreds who were willing to follow him to, the bare hills of northern Israel, they were similarly enthused with these feelings of national identity.
Now, as we go into the 30s, I assume he's in Poland briefly or a little bit.
Yes. Yes.
And in the 30s, is he at that point having debates?
I think he came backwards and forwards to Europe. I know that he attended Zionist congresses. I'm sure he visited his Hasidim in Poland. I know that he went to the United States. He didn't stay, he wasn't permanently in the land of Israel, in Palestine.
Did he debate anti-Zionist Jews ever?
There's no record of it, but I'm assuming that these were conversations that he was having. I do know that he went to visit the Ger Rebbe. The Ger Rebbe was, I would say, the most influential of all the Hasidic leaders in Poland and possibly Europe in those days. He had well over 100,000 Hasidim across Poland and across the Jewish world. And he was somewhat sympathetic to Jewish immigration to Palestine, whereas others were very against it. So he encouraged his followers, his Hasidim, as they were known, as Hasidic people are known, Hasidim of that Rebbe. He encouraged them to move. He opened a yeshiva in Jerusalem. He visited in 1928. The Yablonna Rebbe came to him in Poland and asked him whether or not he should move ahead with his plan to take his Hasidim to the land of Israel, to Palestine. And the Ger Rebbe said to him, and this is recorded in a letter that the Ger Rebbe wrote to another Hasidic Rebbe, the Ostrovtzer Rebbe. He said, the Yablonna Rebbe came to visit me, and he asked me about his project, and I told him it's a terrible mistake to cooperate so closely with the Zionists, with the secular Zionists, because at some stage they may make demands of you that run counter to your orthodoxy, to your Jewish faith, and you won't be able to say no to them because they'll own you because they gave you so much money and so much help. And he assured me, this is what the Ger Rebbe writes to the Ostrovtzer Rebbe, that the Yablonna Rebbe assured him that that would never happen. And then he adds a few words in which he says to Ostrovtzer Rebbe, I hope it's true, but the implication is, I don't think it is true. So he must have debated it with the Ger Rebbe, but he was a very junior colleague of the Ger Rebbe, because whereas he had maybe a couple of thousand Chassidim, the Ger Rebbe had 100,000. So, in terms of clout and power, the Ger Rebbe was far superior to him. He was an A-lister. I'm not sure whether the Yablonna Rebbe was B-list or C-list, but he certainly wasn't an A-lister.
So as the 30s go on, basically there's trouble with this new settlement that he's helped establish in Israel. There's people who they bought land from that don't want to leave, etc., etc. And I presume he has to fundraise, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter what Jewish project you're involved in, you always have to fundraise. Sure, you fundraise for your podcast.
Right,
I mean, that's the way it works.
Right.
And he was running out of money again and again, and he couldn't go back to the same people. And people were getting angry with him because in the 1930s, with the surge in anti-Semitism, particularly in Poland, some of his Hasidim came over and said, where's the land you promised us, the houses you said you'd build for us? And of course, it wasn't there because he'd had to renegotiate the terms with the Zionists, and he'd lost some of the land, and it wasn't possible for him to honor the obligations that he'd made 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier. And he reached a stage where he felt the only thing he could do was go to the United States.
What year?
38. 1938. He went to the United States, and he stayed with his niece who lived there. She had she'd actually grown up in Kfar Hasidim, in this village, but she had abandoned it because it had been too difficult, and she'd moved to New York, and he lived with her. We don't really know what happened to the Yablonna Rebbe's wife. That's very unclear. There's talk of the fact that she may have gone back to Poland and eventually been killed in the Holocaust, but we don't really know. We have no reference as to what happened to her. But we know he was on his own in New York and actually was quite successful fundraising. So, at that time, there was recognition of the need to move Jews out of Poland to a place where they would be safer. People were sensitive to it, and he raised a lot of money. But by that time, the war broke out. So the Germans marched into Poland on the 1st of September 1939. And it was before the Yablonna Rebbe was able to establish some type of channel by which he could send the money to Eretz Yisrael, to pre-state Israel, to Palestine. And now he's stuck in the United States. Poland, which is the country of his birth and probably the country of his citizenship, is at war. The Nazis have taken control. In Palestine, in Kfar Hasidim, he's got a whole bunch of people who really don't like him because he's let them down. And he's stuck in New York. What could he do? So he volunteered for the US military. But they didn't want, a 40-something-year-old rabbi from Poland, 5'6", to join the military. That was not what they were looking for. Yeah. So he joined, he volunteered, or I guess it must have been paid, but he put himself forward for civilian military work, which moved him from New York to California to a dockyard. As you know, that in those days, the shipbuilding mainly took place on the West Coast, because they would then bring the ships through the Panama Canal. But there was a tremendous amount of shipbuilding on the West Coast, and he worked in a shipbuilding yard on the West Coast. About 1942, reports started to come out, the first in the BBC, on the BBC radio, and then the New York Times reported the Holocaust. So there'd been rumors of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust at that stage was fairly new. So we always think of the Holocaust as starting when the war broke out. It didn't really begin in 1939. It really began in earnest in around 1941, 42. And soon afterwards, within a few months, reports began to emerge of the mass murder of Jews, the genocide of Jews by the Nazis in death camps. And when he heard that, he was shocked, absolutely shocked, because he realized that the world that he knew, that he grew up in, was gone forever, and all the people who were his followers were most likely killed. So he's stuck in America on the West Coast. He can't go back to Palestine because they don't want him. And he kind of loses faith. And he thinks to himself, what am I? I'm not a Rebbe. I'm not a leader. I don't really have any place in the world I come from, not in Poland and not in Palestine. I'm going to become an American. And he shaved off his beard, as you saw in that video. And he took off his yarmulke, took off his side locks, and began dressing like, I guess, a secular immigrant would dress. And he changed his name to George Nagel. Don't ask me why. I'm always asked, why did he change his name to Nagel? I haven't the faintest idea. He didn't leave any record as to why he changed his name to Nagel. He kept an initial T, George T. Nagel. T stands for Taub. So that was his original surname. So he signed his name as George T. Nagel, which is the name that you see on the front of the book Paradise Cove, which I know we're going to get to.
Yes, yes. Sorry.
And what did he do? After the Second World War, with all the experience he had gained as on the shipbuilding yard and previously as the builder of Kfar Hasidim, he became a residential contractor, a real estate contractor in the San Fernando Valley, what we call in Los Angeles the Valley. There was a housing boom, post-war housing boom in Southern California, and he was well equipped to make money out of that. And he began building multifamily residential, kind of projects and became fairly wealthy. He was a wealthy man, but he was in complete anonymity. Nobody besides for his immediate family knew where he was or who he was. So he didn't live in a religious Jewish neighborhood. I'm sure he was friendly with Jews, but I know in fact he kept Jewish friends, but that was not his primary, occupation. His occupation was making money and staying out of the limelight. So this once great leader who led a messianic project to pre-state Israel, to build a settlement, an agricultural settlement, who saw not just a national revival, but a religious revival as something which was an imperative for Jewish people, suddenly went into complete anonymity, and left public life, left religious life, had nothing whatsoever to do with the Jewish community, to the degree that nobody locally in Los Angeles knew who he was. They had no idea. They thought he's a little old Polish immigrant called George Nagel. They didn't know that he was once the great Yablonna Rebbe, Rabbi Taub. They didn't know anything about it. And he lived in anonymity for decades. Hard to believe. Today it would be impossible. I have to say, Daniel, today it would be impossible. There's absolutely no way you can go into this level of hiding.
Was it just happenstance that he was in America in 1938 by himself?
Yeah, completely. I mean, it was not planned. He didn't plan to escape from pre-state Palestine. He was intending to come back and reinvigorate it with all the financial resources that he had fundraised on his mission. He'd spent a year in America.
Do you suspect that would have changed everything? If he had brought a few followers with him, the fact that he was alone in this land, in California, I mean, you can't get much further away from Poland, alone in this Technicolor paradise. Do you think that was the crucial factor where, and you got to tell, did he feel sort of forced into becoming the religious leader because of his father? Was this sort of...
I think there's more going on here.
Yeah.
This kind of retrospective is always very dangerous.
Yes,
you don't want to, psychoanalyze someone too much. But I think that we can see the trajectory. I would think he was reluctant to become the Rebbe. So that's headline number one. Headline number two, I think he saw that his role is not to be a Rebbe in Poland, but to do something extraordinary. He wanted to do something very different. So suddenly he seized on this idea, if I'm going to be the Rebbe, then I'm going to do something different, and I'm going to move all my Hasidim to Palestine. So he was a bit of an original in that sense as well, because all of his colleagues, let's call them middle-ranking Hasidic Rebbes in Poland, didn't do this, did they? So he's the only one who did it. Now, it happens to be that he had a partner, the Koznitzer Rebbe, who also brought a few followers, and they were co-founders of Kfar Hasidim. But the Koznitzer, interestingly enough, in 1934, moved from Israel to Paris and became a rabbi of a little shul in Paris. And ultimately, he escaped the Holocaust and he managed to find himself in the United States. And he became a Hasidic Rebbe in New York. And also had nothing more to do with Kfar Hasidim, but in a completely different way. So this idea that he was definitely going to be the Rebbe, well, we know he wasn't going to be. His brother-in-law was meant to be. That if he was going to be the Rebbe, he was going to move to Palestine? Nah, not really. He made that decision after being inspired by a relative to become the Zionist that he became. He certainly didn't foresee the collapse. This is headline number 3, right? He didn't foresee the collapse of Kfar Hasidim. He went there, guns blazing, with rose-tinted spectacles, thinking that this was going to be the most successful messianic project of all time, right? I'm going to build a religious settlement in the north of Israel, and we're going to show them that it can happen, and then other people will follow my lead. Well, that was a bit of a disaster. He certainly didn't foresee the anti-Semitism of Poland in the 1930s that would result in this kind of conflict, this hostility that he experienced from his Hasidim. And he didn't, obviously nobody did, he didn't predict the Holocaust. So there's lots of things along the way that kind of set him on the path that he ultimately was on. And you're absolutely right. Had, let's say, the Second World War not broken out and there not been a Holocaust, and he would have returned to the land of Israel with a lot of money from American donors, his life would have had charted a very different path. But that's, life is what happens while you were making other plans. I think that's John Lennon.
Yes. Now, we're about to get into the book, but one last question before we get there to the late 60s and 70s. And I am going to play armchair psychologist again with this question.
We always do it, but we know we shouldn't.
So it seems to me, this is what's so interesting about him. He's in L.A., he's this, he's alone. He's this immigrant, in this strange land. And it seems like at that point he has two choices, and it's sort of surprising because, as we'll see later in the interview, he understood, in his words, that people were gravitational. They needed others. People are important. They're social.
You need people in your orbit.
Okay, now I want to talk to you about your experiences at this university, because I think your experiences have been interesting, and you speak in such a frank and open fashion about your life here on campus, and it's a bit unusual since you are 2-3 times as old as most, 4 times as old as most of the people here, the students. So you came here in 1968, and did you live in a dormitory immediately?
No.
But you did live in Lincoln Hall at one time.
For a short while, I lived in an apartment. Then I moved in to the dormitory. It was at that time Lincoln Hall. And I liked it because, I may mention that I'm a great believer that people should be with people. Mm-hmm. I say, it's my opinion, that people need gravitation like the stars need gravitation. And they cannot live alone. Stars, a single star in the cosmos will fall down. The same with people if they're by themselves.
Yes.
Maybe we'll get your article, whatever it is.
Right. And so you would think, okay, he understands that, or maybe he didn't at that time. Why doesn't he go and connect with the local Jewish, there are lots of synagogues in L.A., why doesn't he go there? There's community, everything he needs. And so I would assume the reason he doesn't is I don't know. He feels like a new freedom. I can recreate
Freedom.
myself.
I would say it's a crisis of faith. That's how it starts. He knows that he's famous, so that if he goes to an Orthodox shul and people find out who he is, how he looks now, and how people expect him to look is very different. There's a great dissonance between George Nagel and the Yablonna Rebbe. So he feels unable to venture into an Orthodox shul because in the end, his secret will come out. There's no way he's keeping that a secret. He's too well known. Now, I mean, until I began talking about him in 2018, he was long forgotten. But in 1940s, you've got to think that there were many people who had heard of him, even in Los Angeles, who'd heard of the Yablonna Rebbe. He was a famous Rebbe who had brought all his Hasidim from Poland to Palestine. So he was not an unknown quantity. So if his secret came out, that would be a bit of a disaster for him, particularly because he shaved off his beard. And it was just embarrassing, I guess. And he must have found an alternative source of life. Now, he did have friends. I do know of people who he fraternized with, but it was private. He was a very private person. He didn't have a big social circle. He kept himself to himself. He was successful in business. Some of the people he did business with were Orthodox Jews who did know who he was, but he swore them to secrecy, to the extent that there was one person I asked when I got to Los Angeles. I'm from London, as you know, but I live now in Los Angeles. And there was one person I asked, did you ever hear the Yablonna Rebbe growing up? And I knew that this man's father did business with him. So they were together in partnership in various residential projects. He said, no, I've never heard of him. Now, later, I challenged him. I said, you remember I asked you about if you've heard about the Yablonna Rebbe? And you told me you'd never heard of him. I know for sure that you have heard of him. And, here's the pictures. And of course, he nodded and smiled and said, yeah, but he swore us to secrecy. So even, the residual loyalty that they had to this man, even long after he died, was that his secret has to be safe with them. And he kept himself to himself. And you're absolutely right. So, let's try and act as retroactive psychoanalysts. I think there was a deep trauma and he was not able to deal with it in a healthy way. This is an unhealthy way of dealing with trauma, right? I think we can all admit that. This is not a healthy way of dealing with your trauma.
And now we get to the, if you're a screenwriter out there, now we get to the real Hollywood part of the story. This is literally a Rodney Dangerfield movie, Back to School. And this is fascinating. I think this was total genius. So he has this career in real estate. There's a economic turmoil, and basically his business dies, I presume, sometime in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
And
in the late 60s, the housing boom kind of soured.
Right.
And, I think that he had one or two projects that went bad, and then he had a health crisis.
Yeah. And so he does what every 80-year-old old Jewish guy in LA, at 80 years old, or however old he was at that time, does.
In the mid 70s, I would think.
76-year-old does. He decides to go to college for psychology, move into a dorm room.
Amazing. Totally. It's unthinkable today, by the way. Can you imagine I hate to put it this way, some creepy old guy sleeping in the dorm room next door to you, and it's a co-ed dorm. It's a co-ed dorm. Really? I mean, it's like unthinkable. Can you think of any possibility of that happening today? It just wouldn't happen. This is early 1970s, Southern California on steroids, right?
When I started imagining, when I got to see him, and he's a sweet little guy, and the accent, and I just started thinking about the Doors playing and the smoking weed in the hallway and the skateboards and who walks in. I'm your new roommate. It's just it's like the Rodney Dangerfield movie, Back to School.
It's completely unthinkable. You can't. If you try and describe it, it sounds ridiculous. But in the end, he did have a room to himself. I don't know how long that took. but they gave him a room on his own in the dorm, and he became a bit of a campus celebrity.
And I'm convinced it was a totally genius move, right? I think if he had just retired, he would have died. As I think he says in the interview.
And I have great love for the university. I would say the university kept me alive.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And the students that you met there, didn't you have some conflict between you as a man of some age and the young students you lived with?
I never had a conflict. We communicate frankly. I would say at that time it was during the Vietnam War, and people got paid to go to school. And also there was a problem, civil rights. So many black people went to school.
Yes.
Had no problem. We communicated, we lived together, we ate together. That's what I loved most.
Yes.
To eat together and converse while we ate. I had never had any problems with people.
He did the opposite. He didn't retreat and just, retire, sit back. He wanted to connect with people. And, and he does this.
Can I just say, I'm going to put it a different way, which I didn't write in the book, but I've just had this thought. This man was the master of reinvention.
Yes.
And the man reinvented himself time after time after time successfully. Because we haven't even got to the end of the story, right? The end of the story is even more remarkable. But the man was never going to be a Rebbe, becomes a Rebbe. Becomes a Rebbe, he doesn't want to be a normal Rebbe, he becomes a pioneer to Palestine. That doesn't work out, so he goes to New York and goes to the shipyard. That doesn't work out, or he moves on, he becomes an irreligious Jew and is a real estate guy. Then he goes to university. I mean, the man literally has reinvented himself countless times in his life successfully. Amazing, because he's totally convincing. This is not a fraud. By the way, he wasn't a fraud. I don't see him as being a fraud. I think he realized at different points in his life, and maybe that's a healthy thing to be able to do, that what worked for him 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago doesn't work now. And I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do the thing that works for me now, because that's actually better than trying to continue to do the thing that didn't work for me until now.
You have any sense of how spontaneous this decision was for him?
No. So from the information I have from his family, I know that he had a nephew, a great nephew, Ehud Yonai. Ehud Yonai himself is an interesting man, because Ehud Yonai was the one who wrote an article about the Marine base in San Diego titled Top Guns. It was in a magazine called The Californian, which no longer exists. And that article was turned into a very famous film with Tom Cruise. So, Ehud Yonai was a talented journalist, and he lived in Southern California. Obviously, he knew who his uncle was, and he tried to convince him to come back to Israel, and said, it's bygones be bygones, hostility's not there anymore, it's all in the past. Why don't you come back and see your family, move back? You're an old man, you've lived your life here, you've made your point, come back. And I think that from what I heard from the family, Ehud had already passed away by the time I started my investigations, but his wife told me that that at that stage, George Nagel, the Yablonna Rebbe, as he had been, said to his nephew Ehud, actually, no, there's something is still left in me to do before I go back. I've always been fascinated by education and studying. I love reading, and I've never given myself a chance. I never went to any kind of institution of higher education. I want to do it. So I think that it had been something that had been at the back of his mind for many years, but now that his business had failed and he knew that there was, health problems, I think he wanted to get this one thing off his bucket list, but it had been on his bucket list for a long time.
Was it a certainty that he would major in psychology, or could it have been another?
I think he would have done just as well in history, any of the social sciences, literature. He clearly loves reading, so he could have majored in literature. He could have majored in history. He loves history. He clearly has a very high IQ. He's a fast learner. I mean, his written English, I know I've edited it a little bit, but it's really very light touch, the editing. His English is good. His spoken English is good. It's got an accent, but he speaks English well. It's a man who speaks multiple languages, by the way. He speaks Polish, he speaks Yiddish, he speaks Hebrew, and he speaks English. That's the ones I know. I mean, I've spoken other languages I'm not aware of. So, he is a very talented, intelligent person and very curious. You can tell from but we haven't got to the book yet. We're getting to the book.
Yes.
Tell from the book what a curious person he is.
I highly recommend the interview you discovered with him. And it's so interesting. The interviewer asks him, "Oh, you must have had so much conflict with all these young radicals," or, and he's like, "No, I love it. I love to talk and meet my classmates." And he seems to just relish meeting different types of people, younger people, talking after class. It's like you get a sense. Yeah.
In one of the articles about him, which I found quite recently, actually, it says that he joined anti-war demonstrations, in the Vietnam War. And he says he doesn't consider these young people his friends. That means he wasn't close to them, but he fraternizes with them and talks to them. So I would say that they probably saw him as this, nice old man. He's youthful for an old man, but he was somewhat aloof as well, but not that aloof that they would think he's a weirdo or creep. And you see also in his interactions that he describes in the book, that's just not his vibe at all.
Just a mini question. Do you think he ever smoked marijuana?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. It would not surprise me at all, actually. Yeah, I think he's game for a laugh. He'll try anything.
So the title of your book, Paradise Cove, when I saw the subtitle, I thought, that is so interesting. Paradise Cove, they escaped the cuckoo's, am I going to get it wrong? Cuckoo's nest or house?
That's right. No, Cuckoo's Nest. So Paradise Cove, for those of you who don't live in Southern California, is a resort beach in the Malibu area, just north of Los Angeles, northwest of Los Angeles. It emerged as a kind of famous high-class resort area in the 1950s. And he used it as a pseudonym for the institution, the psychiatric facility that he volunteered at. That it was not called Paradise Cove. He says it. What it was called, I've tried to research it, and I've not come up with a good answer. I think there were a lot of these, what were those days called halfway houses. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history here. There was a man called Ronald Reagan. He was the governor of California, and he emptied out all the psychiatric homes, the insane asylums in the 1960s and 70s. They all emptied out, and all these psychiatric patients were suddenly free to roam the streets. But they didn't want to roam the streets, and their families didn't want them. So they created quasi-psychiatric residential facilities that they called halfway houses, where these psychiatric patients could be reintegrated into the community. That was the idea. They don't really exist anymore. So today we associate the word halfway house or the phrase halfway house with people who are on drugs or alcohol addicts who need rehabilitation. So they have a kind of halfway house, or prisoners who are coming out of jail, you come to a halfway house. But in those days, a halfway house in Southern California was a place for psychiatric patients. He volunteered at one. Don't know the name. We know it was in Northridge, which is a residential area in the valley. And so the subtitle of the book, the subheading of the book, They Escaped the Cuckoo's Nest, is a nod to a famous film from the 1970s starring Jack Nicholson, which is based on a book, One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And that book is about a psychiatric facility where Nurse Ratched, who's the anti-hero of the novel and the movie, does everything in her power to keep people within the facility. They're never allowed to leave. So if they are showing signs of getting better, she makes sure to push them back right into their insanity so that she can retain control. She's a bit of a power freak, and she retains control over them. And the movie is about the battle between Jack Nicholson, who's been put in there as a patient, and Nurse Ratched. He, Nagel, Yablonna Rebbe, writing this book with a totally different mindset of what such a psychiatric facility should actually be doing, says they escape the cuckoo's nest because his whole idea is that if somebody comes into a place like that, it's only a transitional phase, and we should be doing everything in our power to reintegrate them into what we would call normal life. So for those of us who are familiar with the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, they'll get the reference. So when he wrote the book in the 1970s, that was, absolute lingua franca. It was currency of the time. Nowadays, I asked my kids, have you ever heard of the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? They never heard of it. They never heard of it.
Yeah. So it seems to me like he was splurging on like sociability by going to college, and then by majoring in psychology, he's sort of feasting on it more, and then doing what he does, where he's literally going to these like kind of support groups for ex-mental patients. He's doing it again. He's just getting more and more. He seems to really enjoy being face to face, meeting new people. So his master's thesis, it consists of these letters he writes his teacher about his activities, helping these ex-mental patients, right, roughly?
Yeah, I mean, he had reached an agreement. He graduated with a BA or whatever it's called in psychology from CSUN. That's the university he went to at those stages. It was called the San Fernando College at that time. It's now called California State University of Northridge, CSUN. He graduates in 1975 with a BA in psychology, and he wants to remain and take a master's. And he's still living in the dorms. And as ridiculous as that sounds, but he's living in the dorms. He can't be bothered going to classes and, taking exams. I mean, man's 80 years old. 1975, he was 80 years old. He just can't be bothered. I mean, it's mind blowing, isn't it? But he wants to take a master's, and he reached an agreement with his professor, Dr. Helen Geet, that he's going to write field reports from about his time as a volunteer in this so-called Paradise Cove facility, and that should count towards his master's as a thesis, I guess. I'm not quite sure what he had in mind. I don't believe it was ever submitted for a master's. At least CSUN cannot confirm that it was ever submitted for a master's. He prepared it for publication, but it wasn't published. What it consists of is 108, actually 107, one letter is missing, 107 missives, letters, if you can describe them that way, that he wrote describing his experiences. And I think initially the idea was for him to kind of frame it around stuff that he'd studied in his psychology major, but it drifts very quickly into just kind of a memoir, kind of diary almost, of his daily activities or regular activities at this facility, and describing the characters who he is taking care of and what they're doing. So it's much more in the genre of like an Oliver Sacks book than it is a master's thesis. But you know what? We get the benefit of it because I wouldn't be that interested in reading his master's thesis, but this is fascinating reading.
Yeah, so I'll play the outsider. Oh, so you found some old guy's homework letters to a teacher? That sounds kind of boring. But I just have a quick clip of him talking about what he did in the letters for the audience.
What is this special point of view of your book, or what kind of contribution does it make?
It's a good question.
No, I mean, it's in the form of letters, is it not?
It's in the form of report to the teacher.
I see.
I didn't know what to do there.
Is it a book of memos, then, huh? What we call memos. This is what I did. And,
No, not technical.
Okay.
As I mentioned before, my tutor instilled in me love for fiction.
Yes.
It is a little bit in the form of a story.
I see.
Every report has a little story.
I see.
It is not the report of a meeting, not minutes of a meeting or something like that. It's a report in the form of conversation. I found it a good system to do it that way.
So tell me how he does that. I mean, are there sort of favorite stories that he tells in the letters that come to mind?
There's one woman who really annoys him because she always calls him early in the morning. So I don't need an alarm clock anymore. This woman calls me every single morning. And he realizes as the book progresses, or as the letters progress, that he's just being used as a crutch. You know, she keeps on saying that she's going to do this and going to do that. She never ends up doing the things she says she's going to do. You know, there's little successes and little failures, and there's all the tension between different members of staff. I mean, it's fascinating because he's like a fly on the wall. He's not working for them. He's working with them, and I kind of respect him because he's an old man, so he's worthy of their respect. And they're also kind of dismissive of him because he's just a volunteer. I mean, he's not a doctor, right? So it's very interesting, the dynamic, the interplay between him and the patients, and between him and the staff members, and his relationship with the professor, the tutor, as he calls her, in the way he kind of addresses things. And it gets wider than that because he's a member, weirdly enough, of a Reform congregation. The thought of a Hasidic Rebbe being a member of a Reform shul is just unbelievable. But okay, he writes to the rabbi to advise the rabbi about the importance of Bikur Cholim, because it's a Jewish ideal that you have to visit the sick. And he says you've got to get some volunteers to come and be nice to these people and for them to include them in their lives. It's fascinating that you see kind of the much broader picture of this man's life. And he doesn't just write about, it would be okay, I guess, as a master's. Maybe this is why it was never submitted as a master's. It would be okay if it was just field reports from the facility, the psychiatric facility, but it's not. He's schlepping with them to birthday parties, and he's taking them to things that he wants to go to, and he's helping them find jobs. And he's like, it's a much broader picture than just somebody who's coming and observing what, a psychologist says about the patient.
What's the general age of these people?
It's not clear. Some of them are older, some of them younger. It seems to me that they're mainly people who are already past their youth. They're not in their teens and 20s. It's people in their 30s, 40s, 50s. He's not clear. Sometimes he mentions how many children they've got and how old their children are, so you can make a educated guess as to how old they are. He's got quite interesting and spicy remarks about the way they look, if they're very overweight or if they're, whatever. I mean, it's interesting. His observation, it's not all PC, that I can tell you.
Yeah, he literally had these cards, right? He would give people that said basically like, hey, if you need somebody to talk to, call me up.
Call me up. This is my number, which is very unorthodox. I mean, you just wouldn't be able to do that today. Yeah, just a volunteer having out-of-facility conversations with a patient is just completely not allowed today. It's not ethical. It's not allowed. But obviously, it's the 1970s California. It's do as you please.
Do you think this was him trying to be a rabbi again in a different way?
So that brings us to the end of the story, because I told you there's a man who's reinventing himself. Yeah. And eventually his nephew, Ehud, that we mentioned him earlier, prevailed on him to return to Israel. And he hasn't been there for many, many, many years. And he's quite frightened about the hostility which he suspects he will have to face. But as it turns out, they prepare an event for him. It's like a reception event where people who he had brought to Kfar Hasidim in the 1920s and their children and grandchildren are there to greet him. And he's brought to the front. It's a very dramatic moment. And he sits there, and one after another, they stand up and say, "Do you recognize me? Do you know who I am?" Probably didn't recognize them. They say, they give their name. They say, "Do you remember you brought us here from Poland?" "Yes." "This is my son. This is my daughter. These are my grandchildren. And if it wouldn't be for you, they wouldn't exist and we'd be dead. You saved our lives. Where have you been? Why did you run away? Why did you abandon us? We want you back. Please come back." And the whole thing was a bit of a setup. And it'd been put together by Ehud and by his mother, I believe, who was the Yablonna Rebbe's niece. And he's so moved by this. He's so taken with it. He'd never thought of it that way. He'd never thought of himself as someone who'd saved people's lives. He'd only ever seen himself as somebody who'd ruined people's lives. And he's so taken with it that he decides to come back. And eventually, not immediately, he came back to Kfar Hasidim. And what's most remarkable is he changed his name back from George and Egel to Yecheskel Tau. He grew a beard, grew side locks, put on a yarmulke, and became the Yablonna Rebbe again. So he ended off his life as the Yablonna Rebbe. And so this unbelievable, it's an arc, isn't it? It's so rare to encounter a story with such a satisfying ending. You know, again, you mentioned Hollywood before. A Hollywood scriptwriter would never dare write a story like this. I mean, it's far too cheesy. It's just impossible. But here it happened. We've got photographs of him with people in Kfar Hasidim, and he's got a beard, and he's got his yarmulke on. It's the same George Nagel who a couple of years earlier is giving that interview on the video. It's the same man, and he's been re-embraced by the world that he had abandoned, and he's become the Rebbe again. And he died there, and he's buried there with full honorifics and titles on his gravestone, and he's remembered very fondly. So there you go, the story.
Just an amazing story that most of us only know because of you and your incredible research ability. I've been watching your commentary, and I love it. I think it's, about what's going on with Israel and anti-Semitism. Let's not talk about Israel. Let's talk about the diaspora. I kind of want to ask, should rabbis bring back excommunication? But what I'm getting at is, it's sort of horrifying. If you look at Gen Z Jewish celebrities, some of them are now just bullied into literally using anti-Semitic terms. This young Jewish actress wrote, "I'm not a Zio." She was just bullied into saying that. And I talked to a friend of mine who I grew up with who became Orthodox a few years ago, and we were talking about it, and we're sort of it's like you either bend or you stand tall.
I have a strong answer to that.
Yeah.
As you know, if you followed me on X, I don't hold back. I'm very strong on pro-Israel advocacy. I'm going to refer it back to the Yablonna Rebbe, because I think that he is a good example of something which is completely dismissed today as being nonsensical. One of the accusations that the anti-Israel lobby is always throwing against Jews is that there's no such thing as an ethnic Jew, and there's no such thing as a Jewish national identity, and that this whole thing is being created by Zionists, and that the State of Israel is a colonial enterprise that's just a tool of the West, and it's an imperial colonial tool that has no place in the postmodern world. I think I'm paraphrasing, but I think you know the gist of this argument. The Yablonna Rebbe, if there's anyone who's proof that that's not the case, it's him. Because think about it. His family were, for hundreds and hundreds of years, European Jews who endured suffering, deprivation, anti-Semitism, hostility, whatever you can imagine, pogroms, and yet they maintained and sustained their Jewish identity. And that Jewish identity was contingent on many things, on religion, but also on this yearning for Zion. And it's in every prayer that we say, we ask God, V'liyerushalayim ircha b'rachamim tashuv, to your city, Jerusalem, please in your mercy, allow us to return. we have this unbelievable yearning within us to come back, not to be Europeans, not to be Americans, not to be Australians. Yes, we are proud of our American or our British or whatever it is citizenship, but nevertheless, we have this unbelievable emotional tie to the land of Israel. And that's not to say we dismiss other people who live there as not being allowed to live there. That's another nonsensical claim. The Yablonna Rebbe, think about it. The man lived in, for all intents and purposes, a first world country. He had no problem with money. He had a wealthy following. So that's one of the interesting things, is that it was his particular Hasidic group was known to be wealthy and successful, to the extent that they could fund him to go to Palestine to build this place. And he upped sticks in the 1920s and went to this third world country. What else could motivate him but his Jewish faith and his Jewish identity? So for any Jew to say, I'm not a Zio, is to completely abandon. Now, it doesn't, political Zionism aside, and you may have agreements or disagreements with the way Zionism was implemented in Palestine, Israel, whatever you're going to say. To say I'm not a Zio is such utter nonsense. It makes no sense. The Yablonna Rebbe is the poster child of how every Jew, religious or secular, has this kind of instinctive, intuitive love of the land of Israel as the land of their heritage, as the land of their Jewish identity. And if you don't, you've actually lost your Jewish identity. Now, there's other ways of losing your Jewish identity. If you can say, I'm becoming a Christian and I believe in Christ as part of the Godhead, then you're a Christian, and obviously you've abandoned your Jewish faith. But no less a part of the Jewish faith is the land of Israel. We believe that the land of Israel is central to our identity as Jews. You can call it Zio, you can call it Israel lover, you can call it whatever you like. That's what it is, and that's the truth.
Last question. Dark question, but I have to ask because you're a rabbi, so I feel I need guidance. So, tell me, you're a pretty cheery guy. You know, you smile a lot. Are you scared? Right? I mean, I think I did some calculations. Joe Rogan has the biggest podcast in the world. He was promoting Nick Fuentes a few days ago. He's bringing Nazis on, Megyn Kelly, Steve Bannon. You start counting this up, and these are some of the biggest podcasts in America. The evil, crazy person, Candace Owens. Tens of millions of people, you know, just listening to this Jew hatred constantly. And it just becomes more and more extreme and mainstream till it's just not even remarkable. The way the metric started to go on like this, the metric I use for anti-Semitism is the stories that would have been scandals 5 years ago that aren't even reported on. Like this comedian Theo Von goes on anti-Semitic rant on Joe Rogan. Not even an article about it. No, but there's just so much. It doesn't even get reported on. Are you scared? Because I find myself thinking thoughts that I never thought I would think about, like, do I really have to learn Hebrew? Shit, I don't want to learn Hebrew.
So I mentioned the arc of history. And the arc of history has proven time and again the triumph of good over evil. You know, I am an irrepressibly upbeat person. That's my nature. So you guessed right. Yes, there are reasons to be frightened. There's certainly reasons to be concerned, very concerned. And we shouldn't dismiss a Joe Rogan and a Tucker Carlson and a Candace Owens and even a Nick Fuentes as being irrelevant. What I would say is I've seen other statistics, and these always shock me when I see them, but you can check them out. You know, the vast majority of people in America aren't even aware that there is a conflict between Israel and Palestine. And if you make them aware of it, they couldn't care less. You know, it doesn't affect them. All politics is local politics. Yes, it's crept more into the mainstream, and it's worrying that it's crept into both parties to such an extent because it's the people in Washington who control international affairs. I mean, as we can see on a day-to-day basis. Having said that, you know, there's a few great glimmers of hope. One of them is the evangelical community in the United States. There's 80 million evangelicals. I don't know what the percentage of those are who support Israel, but it's a very large percentage. And considering the fact that the number of people in the world who are eligible for law of return to Israel is about 25 million. That means including non-Jews who are eligible for the right of return is 25 million. 80 million evangelicals in America, that's huge. And they have a real impact on who gets elected. I speak in churches and I see the love that they have for the Jewish community and for Israel and the support that they are willing to give to Israel. And they've never met Jews. They've never met a Jew. I've been to churches in the Deep South where there's no Jewish community. There's not even a Chabad, okay? Nothing. And they love the Jewish world. They love the scriptures and they love the land of Israel and the state of Israel. So that's a glimmer of hope. And, there's always things, as we've seen throughout history, that we haven't thought of. I happen to think, my politics, anyone who's going to research me is going to see my politics is right of center. And there are very worrying trends in the right of center political ground right now. But I personally think that they started the campaign far too early, that they're too cocky and too confident, and they believe that they have the wind in their sails. But actually, there's 3 years to an election in the United States, and lots of things can happen in those 3 years. So yes, be cautious, be concerned, be watchful, be mindful. Don't rule out learning Hebrew if that's what you need to do. Learn Hebrew, not a bad thing to do, but that doesn't mean we have to pack our bags and leave tomorrow. On the other hand, we shouldn't put that out of your mind. Make sure that your passport is current and that you are able to travel if you need to.
Just that Gen Z scares me. I mean, is there a concept in Jewish term for an evil generation? Is that a thing? No, I'm serious.
I don't know. I'm big into blaming the sin, not the sinner. So I see Gen Z as very good people who are doing very, very silly things, but that doesn't mean that they're evil. I think that we need to, and that's the one last thing I do want to say.
Yeah.
And I also learned it from the Yablonna Rebbe, is that if you believe in something, stand up for it and do it, as you said earlier. Don't just wait for somebody else to take up the fight. You take up the fight. I had this situation here in Beverly Hills where I found out a local, very posh hotel is owned by the Qataris. I protested outside the hotel consistently throughout the period of time that Israel was at war in Gaza and Syria and wherever else, because I believe that Qatar is an evil and pernicious force within the Western world, and that we should identify that evil in every way that we can. And other people said to me, why would you do that? Why do you want to put yourself out there? Why do you want to make yourself a target? And I was a target. I was hacked by the Qataris. I was offered bribes by the Qataris. You can't imagine. But I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to stand up. And I think I don't want to be unique. I think everybody should be willing to stand up for the things that they believe in and do the things that need to get done in order to make sure that their principles are prominent and on display. Don't give up. Never, ever give up. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says the worst thing any Jew can ever do is give up. That's the biggest sin of all. We must never give up. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.